Good afternoon. Welcome to Session 3 on Inactive Ingredient Database and Excipient Considerations. We have 3 presentations in this session. The first presentation will be delivered by Ms. Susan Zook. Ms. Zook is a branch chief in the Division of Regulation, Guidance, and Standards in the Office of Policy for Pharmaceutical Quality. She is the lead for FDA's Inactive Ingredient Database and has served on many FDA committees and working groups related to product safety and quality. She is also currently a member of the FDA's Center for Drug Evaluation and Research Excipient Working Group. Next, we have Dr. Stuti Agarwal from the Division of Pharmacology Toxicology Review in the Office of Safety and Clinical Evaluation within the Office of Generic Drugs. Dr. Agarwal holds a PhD in Pharmacology and Toxicology with a concentration in molecular biology and genetics. She joined the FDA in 2016 and currently conducts safety assessment of impurities, residual solvents, excipients, and extractables and leachables in generic drug products. She's also actively involved in several interdisciplinary and interdisciplinary working groups for process improvement and reviewer training. The third presentation will be delivered by Dr. Amrita Ghosh. Dr. Ghosh is a lead physician in the Division of Clinical Review in the Office of Safety and Clinical Evaluation. She's trained and board certified in internal medicine and hospice and palliative medicine. She also holds a PhD in molecular biology. Currently, she serves as a secondary reviewer for clinical reviews and consults for the generic drug review process. She also serves on working groups related to the safety of pediatric excipient evaluation. The presentations are followed by a question and answer panel discussion that will be moderated by Dr. Michelle Lin, a senior physician in Division of Clinical Review, Office of Safety and Clinical Evaluation. In addition to Ms. Zook and Dr. Agarwal, Drs. Lisa Faulcon, Zhang, and Bryan Newman will join in our panel discussion. Dr. Lisa Faulcon is the Director of the Division of Clinical Review in the Office of Safety and Clinical Evaluation. In her current role, she leads a group of interdisciplinary scientists responsible for providing the clinical assessment of generic drug products and ensuring that allowable differences between a generic drug product and its reference do not alter the safety or efficacy profile. Prior to joining the FDA, she served as an assistant professor of pediatric in the Division of Pediatric Hematology at Johns Hopkins. Dr. Zhang is the lead pharmacologist in the Division of Bioequivalence 3 in the Office of Bioequivalence within the Office of Generic Drugs. He's currently serving as team lead and carries out secondary assessment and works collaboratively to address complex issues identified during bioequivalence assessments. He is also involved in several working groups and research projects at division and office level to support scientific and regulatory-based decision-making for the review of generic products. Lastly, Dr. Bryan Newman, whom you have already been introduced, is a lead pharmacologist in the Division of Therapeutic Performance 1, Office of Research and Standards. We hope you enjoy the session.
Welcome, everyone. I'm Susan Zook. I'm a branch chief in FDA's Office of Policy for Pharmaceutical Quality, and I'm here today because I'm also the lead of the Inactive Ingredient Database team at FDA. I want to begin by first thanking the Center for Research on Complex Generics and the Office of Generic Drugs for allowing me to be part of this very important event. This is a great opportunity for me to share what's new in the IID and maybe clear up some misconceptions. And I'm also looking forward to getting feedback from all of you during our Q&A. I'm going to use the acronym IID when referring to the Inactive Ingredient Database throughout this presentation. For those of you who are familiar with the IID, you're probably aware that the IID is important to many different stakeholders, including those on the new drug side. But for the generic drug developers, it's really an essential tool. Why is that? Well, FDA regulations for generic applications require that applicants demonstrate that excipients used in their products do not affect the safety or efficacy of the product. The IID can provide evidence of previous safe use of excipients, and for this reason, The Office of Generic Drugs often recommends referencing the IID to support the use of excipients in an ANDA. That prior use is important for an ANDA. Unlike new drug applications, for which clinical studies may support the use of a novel excipient, ANDAs rely on previous use to provide evidence of safety. Furthermore, the FDA itself uses the IID, it references the IID during filing decisions and also during the technical assessment of the application. And the IID is used by industry to select appropriate excipients for generic drugs. For all of these reasons, the IID and the generic drug program have been linked for many years. With the importance of the IID in mind, in this presentation, we'll cover relevant aspects of the IID. I'll give a quick introduction to IID terms and data elements, what I call IID basics. We'll discuss recent enhancements to the IID that sought to improve its usefulness. We'll discuss how to calculate excipient maximum daily exposure. And lastly, we'll learn what stakeholders told FDA were their most important priorities for inclusion of excipients in the IID. Let's start with IID basics. The IID is a searchable list of the excipients that have been used in FDA-approved NDAs and ANDAs. Excipients and BLAs are not included in the IID. The IID is published on a quarterly basis. The currently available IID is from the fourth quarter of 2022 and was published in October. Our next publication will be in January of 2023. I've given a link to the IID webpage at the bottom of this slide. The image in the background shows what the IID opening webpage looks like. There's lots of information that can be found on the webpage, including frequently asked questions and a list of all the changes from quarter to quarter in the IID. And you can see what we call the IID change log in the foreground of this slide. There's also an IID guidance, which is currently in draft, and that guidance explains the data elements as well as other information about the IID. The second link at the bottom of the slide will take you to that guidance. If you select the link at the bottom of this slide, you'll go to the IID's opening web page, and it looks like this. The web page invites you to search for an excipient that you're interested in this toolbar in the middle of the search page. You can search for any excipient and you'll see what routes of administration and dosage forms that excipient has been used in approved products. You'll also see the levels, the highest levels of the excipient that have been used for those routes of administration and dosage forms. You can also download the entire IID by selecting the tab shown here, and you can download it into Excel or whatever format is useful to you. Taking a deeper dive, this slide shows you what a search looks like. In order to get the information shown on the slide, I entered an excipient that I was interested in, carbomer homopolymer C, into the search tool. And I got all of these records associated with that particular excipient. Now this slide shows all of the data elements that you'll get in a search in the IID. And I want to bring your attention to the three shown here: the excipient name, its route of administration, and its dosage form. This team of three elements is a record in the IID, and each row in the IID is an individual record. Now you'll notice that for each record we have a numerical value. That numerical value will either be the maximum potency per unit dose, which is the amount of that excipient that's used in one tablet, one capsule, one one dose of that product. In the case shown here, we see that the values are given in percentage weight per weight. That's because these are topical products. And in this case, the value is given as a percentage, a concentration. The other value that you'll see associated with a record is maximum daily exposure. This is the amount of the excipient that a patient would be exposed to if given the maximum daily dose of the product. The FDA is currently in the process of replacing maximum potency values with maximum daily exposure values. And I'm going to talk a little bit more about that soon. The last data element that I want to bring to your attention is this last column, record updated. We flag records that are new in that particular publication cycle with a Y. The IID is very useful to many stakeholders, but it does have its limitations. And I think it's important to review what those limitations are to clear up any misconceptions. While you can search the IID and see what routes of administration and dosage form an excipient may have been used in, you cannot really tell the context of use of that excipient in those products. And that's a big limitation to the IID. You can't tell whether that excipient was used in a product that's a chronically used product or one for short duration. You can't tell if the products were only used in adults or for pediatric use. The IID does not tell an ANDA applicant what's in a specific RLD. The IID does not include excipients used in BLAs or OTC monograph products. And there is no link between the maximum daily exposure values shown for an excipient and those for maximum potency. These typically come from completely different drugs, completely different applications, and shouldn't be assumed to be linked. Now let's look at the recent changes to the IID. The IID did not always have maximum daily exposure of excipients. This is something newly added to the IID. And this came about because when FDA reauthorized the generic drug user fee amendments, what we call GDUFA 2, back in 2018, two commitments were made regarding enhancements to the IID. The first was we committed to add maximum daily exposure for excipients for which information was available. And the second commitment was that we would inform stakeholders of all of the changes that were made from publication to publication. These two enhancements were slated to be completed by October of 2020. The timeline on this slide will give you a picture of when we made the enhancements and some of the infrastructure that facilitated these enhancements. The circles on the timeline mark the quarterly publications of the IID. The first quarterly change log was published in July of 2019, and this was a couple quarters ahead of schedule. The quarterly change log fulfilled that second commitment to inform stakeholders of all the changes from publication to publication. Now, during this same time period, we were furiously building a system to automate the addition of maximum daily exposure to our records, to the IID. And we were able to publish the first maximum daily exposures, or MDE values, in the IID in July of 2020. Now, since that first publication, including maximum daily exposure, with each publication of the IID, we have increased the number of records that include MDE, or maximum daily exposure. Most recently, we published a Federal Register notice requesting input on how we can better build our system to include MDE. And we asked specifically about which excipients should be prioritized. And I'll talk a little bit about that in a couple slides. Next, I'm going to give you a quick overview of how MDE, maximum daily exposure, is calculated in the IID, and then we'll take a look at how the MDE rollout is coming along. The image I'm going to show you is how our system calculates MDE, but as I said, this is all automated in our system. But let's walk through the calculation. For a particular drug, the MDE of an excipient in that product is the maximum daily dose of the active ingredient, what we call MDD, divided by the amount of that active ingredient per unit dose, multiplied by the amount of the excipient per unit dose. And that gives you MDE. Now, a very important part of this calculation is the maximum daily dose of the drug in which the excipient is used. This is information that we have to mine because it's not readily available in applications. I also want to point out that while I like to use the term MDE because it's universal and applies to any type of dosage form, you'll often see the term maximum daily intake used. It's the same calculation, but maximum daily intake is typically used to refer to oral products. Okay, so now let's see how our addition of MDE is coming along since its inception in July of 2020. When we first started adding MDE in our first publication, we had less than 400 records that included MDE, and that was back in July of 2020. But by July of 2022, we had more than 2,500 MDEs, or records with MDE. And that number is continuing to increase with all of our publications. The system was designed to have a gradual increase in the number of records with MDE. But there are things we can do that kind of give us a bump and can increase the number of records. For example, you'll notice that there was a bump in the number of records with MDE between January of 2021 and April of 2021. That's because we did a great deal of data mining to get those maximum daily doses of the drugs in which these excipients are used. Another way that we can accelerate the inclusion of MDE into our system is to target specific excipients. And that leads me to my next topic: stakeholder input. In March of this year, FDA published a Federal Register notice asking for public comments on the IID. The issues that stakeholders were asked to comment on were about prioritization of excipients for that MDE rollout. And we also asked whether dosage forms as well as routes of administration were still useful in the IID. I've given an abbreviated version of the questions here. But the questions were actually a little bit more involved in this, but this was the basic gist. Should we eliminate dosage forms and just have routes of administration for excipients? Are there categories of excipients that should be prioritized in our MDE rollout? And are there specific excipients that should be made the highest priority? Well, here's what our stakeholders said. Most stakeholders want dosage forms to remain in the IID. They said that they do use them. Their formulators need to have the dosage forms. It's very helpful. But a few stakeholders did say that for oral products, routes of administration would be sufficient. With respect to prioritizing categories of excipients for MDE, stakeholders gave a variety of responses. Some said we should prioritize the most commonly used excipients, while others wanted the unique, uncommon excipients that may have been used for complex dosage forms. And still others identified specific categories such as flavors, emulsifiers, polymers, and surfactants as being highest priority categories. To the third question, in which we asked stakeholders to identify individual excipients, unfortunately, this did not yield any consensus. In fact, most stakeholders did not tell us which specific excipients to prioritize for MDE. But a few excipients were named, and going forward, we're looking into how we can address this feedback. Our focus now, going into 2023, is to try to increase the number of records with MDE, to give it a bump. And with that, I want to leave you with some contact information. If you have questions about information that you see in the IID, or you think that something is incorrect and you want us to make a correction, please email us at iidupdate@fda.hhs.gov. That's our mailbox for the IID team. Nomenclature questions should be addressed to FDA's SRS system. The substance registration folks are the ones that assign preferred terms for our excipients. So if you think that the name is incorrect, you can email them at the second address on this slide. And with that, I want to thank the IID team. Of course, I don't work on the IID all alone. I have a great team behind me, and they work very hard. And I want to thank all of you for listening, and I look forward to your questions.
Hello everyone, I'm Stuti Agarwal and today I will be presenting the current approaches and review process of safety evaluation of excipients in generic drugs. In this presentation, I will briefly explain what are generic drugs and what are excipients. This will be followed by general approaches of safety assessment of excipients. Then I will discuss some case studies followed by summarizing this presentation. So what are generic drugs? Generic drugs are submitted as abbreviated new drug applications via 505J regulatory pathway because they do not contain phase 3 clinical trial data for efficacy and safety. Generic drugs are pharmaceutically equivalent to the reference listed drug in their active pharmaceutical ingredient, dose strength, dose form, and other applicable standards of identity, strength, quality, and purity. Please note, generics must demonstrate bioequivalence to the RLD. However, generics are not always identical copies of the RLD, meaning differences in excipients are allowed for certain dosage forms, such as products administered via parenteral, ophthalmic, or otic route are required to be qualitatively and quantitatively same as their RLD. There are some exceptions, such as buffers, antioxidants, and preservatives can be different if information is provided to support their safety. Products for other routes are not required to be qualitatively and quantitatively same as RLD. However, safety of excipients must be justified. Nevertheless, despite differences in the formulation, the safety profile of the generic should be similar to the RLD. So what are excipients? Excipient or an inactive ingredient is any component other than an active ingredient that is added during the manufacturing process and is present in the final drug product. It includes but not limited to coloring, flavoring, preservative, and solvents. Inactive ingredients in generic drugs are evaluated by multiple offices in CEDAR and multiple divisions within OGD. To support the filing of an ANDA, Division of Filing Review checks proposed excipient level in a formulation against the listing in the Inactive Ingredient Database or IID. Office of Bioequivalence assesses if the proposed maximum daily exposure for a specific route of administration has precedent in an FDA-approved drug product for same route of administration. Quality discipline assesses quality parameter of the excipient, that is, excipient's identity and purity. Pharmatox division, that is division of pharmacology toxicology review, and clinical division, that is division of clinical review within OGD, are consulted when there is a safety concern on the proposed formulation during the ANDA review. Meaning, if proposed MDE of an excipient exceeds approved level for the same route, or is for longer duration of use, or is new to the patient population. For rest of the presentation, I will be referring to maximum daily exposure as MDE. Let's discuss the safety review process of an excipient by OGD. While reviewing the safety of an excipient, the ultimate question to address is, will the excipient at the proposed amount change the safety profile of the generic drug when compared to the RLD? Please note that context of use drives the safety assessment of an excipient, meaning the dose and duration of exposure, route of administration, and indicated patient population are considered while evaluating the safety of an excipient. During the ANDA review, clinical and pharmatox discipline generally jointly assess worst-case exposure by calculating the MDE of an excipient based on maximum daily dose of that drug product. Approaches detailed in FDA's excipient guidance are applied to assess safety of the formulation in the targeted population. Division of Clinical Review also considers evidence of safe use in humans, including previously approved level of excipient. IID is an important tool which can inform prior evidence of safe use for proposed level of excipient in an FDA-approved drug product. It lists the maximum potency, that is highest level of excipient per unit dose in each dosage form, and MDE of an excipient by a specific route of administration. The IID is used by innovator and generic drug applicants. It can be accessed at the given link. So, to reiterate, as safety of excipients is assessed based on the principles from FDA's guidance on excipient, the context of use plays an essential role in determining whether the proposed level of an excipient poses a concern in a given drug product. If excipient is not qualified at the proposed level, safety justification will be required to support the route of administration and duration of exposure in the intended patient population. DPTR considers relevant toxicology information while reviewing the safety of an excipient. The journal toxicity studies are considered and recommended based on duration of use of the drug product as shown in the table on the right. Other non-clinical studies like reproductive toxicity, genotoxicity, and carcinogenicity study also play an important role in safety assessment of an excipient as they can address the endpoints which are not feasible in clinical trials. Considering dose makes the poison, margin of exposure are calculated from appropriate journal toxicity studies to determine the safe level of an excipient in a given drug product. If an ANDA applicant wishes to obtain feedback on proposed level of excipients in a specific formulation, a control correspondence can be submitted to OGD or a pre-ANDA meeting can be requested. Details on the process for both can be found in guidance for industry as shown here. Considering that about 90% of the prescription drugs in the US pharmaceutical market are generics, OGD receives significant number of ANDA applications each year. However, pharmatox and clinical disciplines don't review all the submitted ANDAs as we are consulted when there is a safety concern. It is important to note that if the safety of generic drug product is not justified due to unacceptable level of excipients, ANDA will not receive approval. After pharmatox and clinical review, If a gap in safety data remains, non-clinical information may be requested to address the data gap, and in cases where clinical data are required or a novel excipient is proposed which needs an extensive battery of safety studies, the applicant will be advised to reformulate or pursue a 505(b)(2) pathway. In order to give you a better understanding of safety evaluation of excipients by Pharmatoxin Clinical Division, I will now present few case studies. Case 1 represents a safety evaluation of an excipient A in an oral capsule. Proposed generic is a central nervous system stimulant formulated into a delayed release oral capsule, which is indicated in pediatric population of 6 years and above. The drug is indicated for chronic use. Proposed level of excipient A exceeds the level in FDA-approved drug products with similar context of use. Please note, excipient A is a high molecular weight polymer. To justify the proposed level, applicant referred to public IID and indicated that the highest IID level by oral route exceeds the proposed level of excipient A in their drug product. During pharmacotox safety review, it was determined that applicant's justification included MDE from a drug product which had a different context of use, that is, it was an acute use drug indicated only in adult patients. Per published literature, it was also determined that excipient A is non-genotoxic, non-carcinogenic, and is generally not expected to be absorbed due to high molecular weight. However, its low molecular weight forms have toxicity concerns. As the proposed drug product is indicated for chronic use, a 90-day repeat dose oral toxicity study in rat was considered to evaluate the toxicity profile of this excipient. No overt toxicities were noted in this study, and high margin of safety was calculated for the proposed MDE of excipient. Based on published toxicity data, the estimated acceptable daily intake for this excipient was found to be much higher than the proposed MDE. Therefore, no safety concerns were raised from pharmacotox perspective. During clinical safety review, based on medical literature and by the presence of this excipient in an FDA-approved drug product with similar context of use, it was determined that the safety of this excipient in pediatric patient is justified. Considering that daily average exposure in adults and young children for this excipient as food additive is much higher than the proposed MDE, no safety concerns were raised from clinical perspective. In regulatory recommendation, the proposed MDE of excipient A was found acceptable in the drug product. Case 2 represents a safety evaluation of excipient B in an oral suspension. Proposed generic is a cough syrup indicated in pediatric population of age 2 years and above for short-term repeated and intermittent use. To be noted, per RLD label, this drug product can be given to infants as young as 6 months based on physician's advice. Excipient B level exceeds the level in FDA-approved products with similar context of use. Therefore, to justify proposed level, applicant submitted comparative study with RLD and indicated similar level of excipient in the RLD as proposed level. They also submitted published toxicology data and published literature indicating excipient as generally recognized as safe or GRAS. During pharmacotox safety review, it was determined that excipient B is rapidly absorbed from gastrointestinal tract after oral ingestion. And based on pharmacokinetics data from published literature, the half-life of excipient B in infants was found to be about 10 times longer than that in adults. This raises the risk of overexposure of this excipient in pediatric patients. Due to insufficient non-clinical toxicology data to assess the safety of this excipient in pediatric patient, safety concern was raised from pharmacotox perspective. During clinical safety review, based on medical literature, it was determined that there were significant concerns with excipient B in patients with renal or hepatic insufficiency and in children less than 4 years of age. Considering that young children have immature hepatic and renal function, the potential of excipient B accumulation increases in this population, which may cause aggravated toxicity from this excipient in this population. No FDA-approved drug product with similar context of use was found to support the safety of the proposed MDE of excipient B in patients as young as 6 months. Therefore, safety concern was raised from clinical perspective. In regulatory recommendation, deficiency was identified. An ANDA applicant was recommended to reformulate to remove excipient B or reduce its level to what is in FDA-approved product with similar context of use. Applicant was also recommended to use controlled correspondence process to obtain feedback on formulation if needed. Later, applicant complied and reduced the level of excipient B to an acceptable amount and ANDA was approved. Case 3 represents a safety evaluation of an excipient in topical lotion, which is indicated in pediatric population of 6 months and above and in adults for short-term repeated and intermittent use. RLD does not contain excipient C. In their justification, applicant indicated that excipient C is present in prescription drugs, over-the-counter drugs, as well as in cosmetics. Applicant also submitted non-clinical toxicity data to support proposed level of excipient C. During pharmacotox safety review, it was determined that excipient C is listed as active ingredient under 21 CFR 310.545 and is used as active ingredient for topical drug products. It was found to be non-genotoxic, but no juvenile toxicity study to inform safety in pediatric patients from 6 months and older was found. Please note, RLD labeling indicates that API can cause local adverse effects such as skin irritation. Also, per published literature, excipient C is known to increase dermal penetration of other chemicals, which means that it can increase the exposure to API, leading to worsening of local adverse effects from API. Therefore, safety concern was raised from pharmacotox perspective. During clinical safety review, based on medical literature, it was determined that at the proposed MDE, excipient C is a skin irritant and an allergen. And at 1/10 of the proposed MDE, excipient C is an eye irritant in adults and in children. Based on the indicated method of use, there is a high risk of this drug product to get exposed to young children's eyes. Therefore, this unintended exposure was considered by evaluating the safety of this excipient in the proposed generic. Clinical team also indicated that systemic overexposure to API may cause adverse effects, particularly in young children. Considering that excipient C can increase the absorption of API, it can worsen the adverse effects, both local and systemic, caused by API, such as skin irritation, metabolic dysregulation, and neurotoxicity. Clinical team also determined that applicant's justification is not acceptable as cited prescription drugs in their justification are for a different context of use. That is, drugs were indicated in adults only or indicated to be used in hospital setting. As applicant has indicated in their justification that this excipient is present in cosmetics, please note, use in cosmetics generally not considered appropriate for supporting safe use in drugs. No FDA-approved drug product with similar context of use was found to support the safety of proposed MDE of excipient C in pediatric patients. Therefore, safety concern was raised from clinical perspective. In regulatory recommendation, deficiency was identified. ANDA applicant was recommended to provide additional data to show the proposed MDE of excipient C does not change the safety and efficacy of the drug product, or reformulate to remove excipient C from their drug product, and if needed, they can use controlled correspondence process to obtain feedback on formulation. So to summarize, ANDAs must be pharmaceutically equivalent to the RLD. In general, generic drugs may differ in composition from the RLD due to excipients in their formulation. However, there are some exceptions. Safety review of excipients. is generally handled by clinical and pharmacotox discipline on a consult basis. Principles from FDA's excipient guidance are applied, and context of use drives the safety assessment of an excipient, meaning duration of use, patient population, and route of administration are considered to determine whether the proposed level of an excipient poses a concern in a given drug product. IID is a great tool used to identify prior evidence of safe use of an excipient by a given route of administration. However, other information such as published literature, relevant human safety data, and toxicology studies are also used to inform risk. If a safety data gap is identified, a deficiency may be issued, which means the ANDA does not receive approval. In that case, applicant may be recommended to reformulate or submit a revised justification to support the proposed level of excipient in their drug product. In cases where clinical data are required or a novel excipient is proposed, which needs an extensive battery of safety studies, the applicant will be advised to reformulate or pursue a 505(b)(2) pathway. Ultimately, the goal of safety review of excipients in generics is to ensure that the safety profile of generics is similar to the RLD to support OGD's mission to bring high-quality, safe generics to the American public. These are some links to excipient-related resources. With that, I would like to thank my supervisors, team leads, and other team members of Division of Pharmacology and Toxicology Review for helping me in preparation of this presentation. I would also like to thank Division of Clinical Review for their collaboration and DPTR and DCR management for their support. Thank you for your attention.
Good morning, and thank you for attending this presentation on the safety review of pediatric excipients. My name is Amrita Ghosh, and I am a lead physician in the Office of Safety and Clinical Evaluation in the Division of Clinical Review. I have no financial relationships to disclose relating to this presentation. This presentation reflects the views of the author and should not be construed to represent FDA's views or policies. Here's some background on this subject. An excipient is any inactive ingredient intentionally added to a therapeutic or diagnostic product that's present in the to-be marketed drug product. They are not intended to exert therapeutic effect at the intended dosage, and they may be used to improve product delivery, for example, to enhance absorption or control release of the drug substance. In general, applicants must identify and characterize the inactive ingredients in the proposed drug product and provide information demonstrating that such inactive ingredients do not affect the safety or efficacy of the proposed drug product per 21 CFR 314.94A92. Some important safety considerations are that commonly used excipients, while they are used in adults, may not be commonly used in pediatric formulations. Acceptable levels in adult formulations do not always guarantee acceptable levels for pediatric formulations. And maximum daily exposure in pediatric formulations is not always evident in the inactive ingredient database, or IID. Some excipients that are commonly used in adults have been associated with risks in children. Toxicity may vary across pediatric age groups and also between pediatric and adult populations, for example, with benzyl alcohol and benzyl derivatives and with propylene glycol. I'd like to outline our approach to excipient safety review. Here I'll be referencing the guidance for industry, good ANDA submission practice. The final guidance document was published in January 2022. It states that a generic drug product formulation should include inactive ingredients that have a well-defined safety profile for the proposed context of use, i.e. dose, route of administration, duration of use, and patient population, and maintain the same safety profile as the reference listed drug or RLD. We employ a risk-based approach using the principles in the guidance for context of use. These principles for the proposed ANDA should be similar to the RLD. The route of administration and dosage form, the level and duration of exposure, and the patient population. We'll explore each of the principles of context of use in the upcoming slides. Proposed levels of an excipient may be acceptable even if the RLD does not have that excipient, or the proposed product has higher levels of that excipient than there are in the RLD. But levels have to be comparable to another FDA-approved product with comparable context of use. So let's review the general principles of context of use. The first principle has to do with the route of administration and dosage form, and these should be similar to the approved product. For example, we compare oral products to other FDA-approved oral products, parenteral products to other FDA-approved parenteral products, and so on. Excipients used in an FDA-approved drug product for a particular route of administration can generally be considered safe for use in a similar manner for a similar type of product. The dosage form, for example, a gum, lozenge, orally disintegrated tablet, or sublingual film, should be similar to ensure that the safety assessment is based on appropriate comparison. It's important to consider children's ability to swallow the drug product as well. For example, children may or may not be able to swallow a tablet or a capsule. Sometimes a different route of administration or dosage form may be used to establish safety. Principle 2 has to do with the level and duration of exposure, and these principles also should be similar. Levels of excipients established for adult use may affect children differently. There are age-related differences in absorption, distribution, metabolism, and elimination, and understanding those differences inform us about the acceptability of excipient levels. Duration of treatment is defined as acute, treatment consisting of a single dose or lasting for a few days, so that's short-term use. Intermediate, clinical use of more than 2 weeks, but less than or equal to 3 months, and chronic use, repeated intermittent use lasting longer than 6 months, so that's long-term. Principle 3 is regarding the patient population. Children shouldn't be considered miniature adults, nor should they be evaluated as a single group. Because of physiological and pharmacokinetic differences, toxicities may be different in pediatric patients as compared to adults, as well as within pediatric subpopulations, so like neonates, infants, children, and adolescents. The population at risk should be similar. We need to consider whether the intended patient population is at increased risk for the known adverse events. For example, premature and newborn infants have delayed liver maturation and may be at increased risk of toxicity when exposed to high levels of benzyl derivatives. In addition, conditions treated by each product should be similar. In other words, drug products should be used to treat similar types of conditions. For example, they should both be indicated for common pediatric conditions versus they could both be indicated for rare or life-threatening illnesses. We need to consider the disease or condition the drug is indicated to treat, prevent, cure, or mitigate. For example, a drug used for the treatment of a rare or life-threatening infection where few other treatment options exist may not be an appropriate drug to justify a product intended for the treatment of a more common infection. Now we can talk about our approach to pediatric excipients. Here's a list of excipients with known toxicities in the pediatric population. Parabens, benzyl alcohol and benzyl derivatives, benzalkonium chloride, thiomersal, ethanol, propylene glycol and PEG, glycerol, peanut oil, and sulfites are some examples of known toxicities which are listed in this table. the list is not exhaustive. And here are their uses, some of their major uses, and some of the toxicities that are associated with these excipients. Benzyl alcohol and derivatives are one family which are used in formulations as preservatives. Enzymes that metabolize benzyl derivatives are immature in neonates and infants. Metabolates may displace bilirubin from albumin and could lead to hyperbilirubinemia, bilirubin encephalopathy, and kernicterus. Benzyl alcohol metabolites may build up in immature metabolic systems, like in preterm neonates, and infants, and has been linked to gasping baby syndrome and death in preterm neonates and low birth weight infants. Adverse events have been reported in the medical literature in children up to age 6. The agency has not established a safe level of benzyl alcohol or derivatives for pediatric populations. Our assessment of benzyl alcohol and benzyl derivatives involves a risk-based approach. Benzyl alcohol may be acceptable if the levels are similar to an FDA-approved product with similar context of use. If there's more than one benzyl derivative, each derivative should be assessed individually for safety. If the RLD was reformulated to a benzyl alcohol-free formulation, the proposed generic product may still contain benzyl alcohol as long as the reformulation was not for product-specific safety issues. So let's look at a case study so we can illustrate the concepts of a risk-based approach using the principles of context of use. A proposed generic application, drug A, is for an oral solution, and the drug product is indicated in the pediatric population, and it's for a common illness. So the proposed product contains benzoic acid as an excipient and contains benzyl alcohol in the flavoring. The RLD for this proposed product was withdrawn, but not for reasons of safety or efficacy. And the RLD has less benzoic acid, and it's not clear if the RLD flavor contained benzyl alcohol. So during our review, we found other FDA-approved products which aren't the RLD, drug B and drug C, that are indicated in the pediatric population. Drug B has a higher level of benzyl alcohol, and drug C has a higher level of benzoic acid. So our question is, can the respective proposed levels of benzyl alcohol be justified using drug B, and the proposed level of benzoic acid be justified using drug C? Let's explore the justification for these comparisons. So for benzyl alcohol, drug B is indicated for common illnesses and has 1 through 3 in common with drug A. The route of administration is oral, the duration of exposure is acute, and it's used in pediatric patients. So we see that similar conditions are being treated by both of these products. For benzoic acid, in adults, drug C has 1 through 3 in common with drug A. Number 1, route of administration is oral. Number 2, duration of exposure is acute. And number 3, there's a similar population and conditions that are being treated. But in pediatrics, drug C has 1 through 2 in common with drug A. So 1, route of administration is oral, and 2, duration of exposure is acute. However, indications for drug C in the pediatric population are for rare, serious, and life-threatening infections where few other treatment options exist. So these are different than conditions treated with drug A. Remember, drug A is indicated for a common illness. Agency reviewers searched and found another drug, drug D, indicated in infants, children, and adolescents for common illnesses. Here, I just want to note that we had a previous presentation regarding the IID, which went over how to use the IID and notes that it does not provide context of use for the product. Now we can see that drug D has all three in common with the RLD for the proposed product. 1, route of administration is oral. 2, duration of exposure is acute. 3, they're both used in pediatric patients for common conditions. So drug D has a similar context of use to the RLD, and drug D has a higher maximum daily exposure, or MDE, for benzoic acid, and therefore this product supports the proposed levels of benzoic acid. So what is the answer to our case? Can the level of benzyl alcohol be justified using drug B, and can the level of benzoic acid be justified using drug C? The answer is benzyl alcohol can be justified using drug B, but benzoic acid cannot be justified for the entire population using drug C, because in the pediatric population, drug C is indicated for rare, life-threatening infections with few treatment options. And that's different from drug A. So alternative products like drug D may be able to justify the level of benzoic acid. So here are the key takeaways from this presentation. Sometimes excipients that are commonly used in adults have different risk or safety concerns in children. It's important to consider the fact that the pediatric population has unique safety concerns that are unlike those of adults. Remember, children are not miniature adults. Consider a risk-based approach to your excipient safety evaluation using the 3 principles of context of use, as in the guidance, good and submission practices. And consider early communication through controlled correspondences to determine whether excipient levels may be appropriate for your proposed drug product. Thank you.
Thank you to our speakers for the excellent presentations, and welcome everyone to our session 3 question and answer panel. I would like to ask our panelists to please turn on their camera at this time. And once again, our panelists will include our speakers, Susan Zhang and Dr. Stuti Agarwal. Dr. Lisa Faulcon will join us in place of Dr. Amrita Ghosh. And we also welcome Drs. Zhang and Bryan Newman. All right, and just a reminder, if you haven't had the chance, please enter your questions in the chat box and direct it to everyone. Please also keep in mind that this workshop is for scientific exchange and not to address any specific drug development questions. We will do our best to answer as many questions as possible during the allotted time. So the first question is for Susan. For certain excipients, there is no potency value, but there is an MDE value. How can we use this to understand what is the maximum percentage weight for weight to be used for topical products?
So if there is a maximum daily exposure, that's going to be given in milligrams because it's the summation of all of the doses that would be given in a day. You really can't go backwards from that level, that maximum daily exposure, and figure out what the concentration of that excipient is in the drug. So you really can't find percentage weight per weight based on maximum daily exposure. And if you're trying to match a product, for example, that has to be Q1, Q2, you'll have to use other means to get to that.
Thank you. Our next question is actually also for you as well, Susan. For a product with multiple routes of administration, how do we choose the applicable MDE or potency value? Do we base it on worst case?
Well, that's a very good question, and thank you for the question. When a product has multiple routes of administration, of course, the excipient has to be found in the IID or in other ways proven to be used for each of those routes of administration. You should be looking at the amount that is permitted for each of those routes of administration. And rather than choosing the worst case, I would say choose an amount that allows it to be matched to the amounts that are in the IID for that particular route of administration. So it would probably be the least worst case in that case, because you'd want to, whichever was the lowest amount, that would be the most prudent amount to choose. But I have to say that, you know, not everything is found in the IID. And when in doubt, it's always prudent to submit a controlled correspondence if you feel that the drug requires a higher amount, because you might find that the Office of Generic Drugs is able to justify the amount that you're proposing.
Thank you. Our next few questions are for Dr. Agarwal. First one is for preservatives which degrades continuously, how do we set the impurity limit for them?
Thank you, Michelle, for the question. So at present, excipient impurities limits, they do not fall under the scope of FDA ICH guidances like ICH Q3B guidance. However, when we are reviewing the safety of an excipient in certain conditions or under certain circumstances, USP specification for excipient degradants can be considered in our review, technical review. And so in certain cases, safety of excipient related to impurities of an excipient is actually evaluated on case-by-case basis. And emphasis is on the context of use of the drug product, that is duration of use, patient population, and the dosage form, etc. Thank you.
Thank you, Stuti. The next question for you is, since MDE values are based on MDG of the active ingredient, how can we know what was maximum daily dose of the active for the listed information in the IID?
A good question. As you heard in Dr. Zwick's presentation, that FDA is making a lot of effort to include MDEs in the IID. So soon you will see a lot more MDEs included that will help you in determining how much excipient you will be safe in using in your drug product. However, if an applicant is still need to have the information of what MDE can be allowed, they can always reach out to us by control correspondence process. And for that, please refer to the guidance for control correspondence.
Thank you. Our next question is for Dr. Faulcon. Is there a general factor that can be considered to convert the IIG in adults to neonates?
Thank you for that question, Michelle. In general, there isn't a specific factor that can be used to convert the IIG to in adults to neonates, assuming that for pediatric patients like neonates, the MDE should be determined based on the information that's provided in the labeling, right? The dosing recommendations indicated in the labeling. So the IAD may be used as supportive information, but referencing the IAD or trying to come up with a conversion factor that would inform or that would be able to apply the information from the IID in adults, it may not be appropriate. Instead, like I said, you should, the applicant should reference and refer to and determine the MDEs based on the information in the label.
Thank you very much, Lisa. We are going back to you, Sue. The next question is there a potential of including the product source of the MDE value in the IID database?
Thanks for the question. We do not intend to include the source for the information that you see in the IID because we are entrusted with protecting proprietary information. The products from which these ingredients are taken to include in the IID are usually multiple products, and all of those product formulations are proprietary. So we don't intend to include that source information.
Thank you. And for our next group of questions, this is addressed to Stuti. If a grandfather product has been used for many years, can the product be FDA approved without clinical studies in relevance to excipient safety based on the product use history?
Thank you, Michelle, for the question. So a generic does not typically require clinical studies. And if there is a prior precedence of safety for the excipient in FDA-approved drug products for similar context of use, yes, it can be done.
Great. Right. Thank you. And next question also for you, Stuti, is for excipients, which is not in the IID, what information is expected in the ANDA submission?
Okay, thank you, Michelle. Good question. So if an excipient is not listed in the IID, that means it can be a novel excipient. And in that situation, if firm can submit a control correspondence for the guidance to get our input, whether it will be acceptable excipient for a generic or not, that will help them in formulation. And during our review, if we determine that this excipient is not present in any FDA-approved drug product, then the submission has to be done by a 505(b)(2), because it will require extensive battery of studies to justify the safety of the excipient.
Thank you very much. Dr. Zhang, we have a question for you. Should we consider different grades for the evaluation of excipients?
Sure, thank you, Michelle. Yeah, in general speaking, yes, during our B assessment stage, we do consider the different technical grade of excipient, because different grade or subtype of excipient may have different physicochemical properties. For example, different molecular weight, different viscosity. Their function used in the product formulation could be also different. Although in some cases, the different excipient grade might be justified based on scientific rationales, but it should be justified or considered on a case-by-case basis. So when you developed your drug product from safety or efficacy perspectives, we highly recommend you consider the potential impact of the excipient grade or subtype. So if applicable, and the excipient in your proposed formulation should be evaluated based on a specific grade. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Shi. And Stuti, would you like to add something to that question?
Yes, thank you, Michelle. I agree with Dr. Zhang on that, what he said, but I would just like to add that when you are referencing an IID listing for an excipient in your drug product, which has a different nomenclature or molecular weight, viscosity, or a different grade, you should consider provide justification for citing the IID listing as a basis for the excipient, for your excipient, and its proposed level of use. So what I mean by that is that in such cases, applicant should provide a justification supporting the safety of the proposed inactive ingredient grade while relying on the established safety information from the similar grade of excipient. Let's say if it's a different molecular weight, then you should try to look into higher and lower molecular weight inactive ingredient and see the safety studies available for both of them, and make a assessment of how your excipient will behave being in between that molecular weight. And just keep in mind that the justification should provide sufficient detail on the specific grade when in the proposed formulation and whether the similarities. And so when you are giving that justification, very clearly define what are the similarities and what are the differences between your excipient and the excipient present in the IID. So while reviewing, we will consider the acceptability of such excipient at the proposed maximum daily intake on the case-by-case basis while reviewing. And if you want to see more details on that, please refer to FDA's guidance on industry for good and submission practices, as well as non-clinical study for safety evaluation of pharmaceutical excipient guidance. That will give you much more detail about how to go about difference in grades.
Great, thank you so much. Our next question is actually regarding one of your slides, Stuti. It says, in slide 15, it is stated that the relevant human safety data can also provide information on the risk. Is reference to usage in approved drug products outside of the US can be considered as relevant and adequate in case of usage of an excipient at a higher level or a different route of administration versus what is currently in the IID?
Thank you for the question, Michelle. When you are referencing a product approved outside the US, considering we don't have complete information about those products, it might not be sufficient to inform prior findings of safety of that excipient, especially considering the context of use for the product to be marketed in the US. And that is because a lot of time FDA has no information or not sufficient information, whether the excipient was assessed during the drug approval of a product or not, because it is outside the US. So I wouldn't say that it would be a sufficient reasoning to expect acceptancy of an excipient based on it has been approved outside.
Great, thank you so much. We're going to change now to Lisa. Here is a question for you. If multiple strengths are available for a drug product and one or more excipients are not dosed proportionally the same, how will we determine the MDE for such an excipient?
Thank you for that question. I will start us off by providing sort of a general approach, and then I'm going to refer to my colleague, Dr. Zhang, to provide additional context. And so in general, when a drug, first of all, let me just make sure I understood your question. So you're asking whether or not if there are multiple strengths of a drug product that's available, and one or more of the strengths are not dose proportionally the same, how to determine the MDE for that product, yes, is that right?
Yes, that's
okay,
correct.
Great. And so in general, when there are more than one drug product, more than one dosage form or strength available, the MDE for the excipient is based on the maximum daily dose of the MDD using the lower strengths. And providing, and this is, with the provision that the dose, a dosing regimen using the lower strengths is realistic in clinical practice. And sometimes there are, in some instances, there are excipients, there are safety concerns for specific populations, such as pediatrics or those with renally impaired disorders or conditions. And so in these instances, the MDD in the specific patient population needs to be considered to appropriately evaluate the MDE of the excipients.
Dr. Zhang,
Yes, sure. Thank you, Michelle. Thank you, Lisa. Yes, I completely agree with Dr. Faulcon. So just want to emphasize here. So if multiple strengths are available can be administered to achieve this MTD, maximum daily dose. But one or more excipients are not dose proportional. The worst case scenario should be considered. That means the daily exposure should be calculated for each strength, and the potentially highest daily exposure level will be considered as MDE that should be justified in your application. So again, please consider the clinical feasibility as Lisa mentioned earlier. So for any specific question regarding the proposed excipient level, or even like how to calculate MDD and MDE, you may submit a control correspondence to the agency. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Dr. Faulcon and Dr. Zhang. The next couple of questions is for you, Lisa. First one is, would an ANDA applicant for an oral solution intended for pediatrics need to test the finished product for benzyl alcohol or a declaration from the flavor supplier for the absence of benzyl alcohol to be sufficient to justify the proposed flavor?
Okay, so in general, applicants must identify and characterize the inactive ingredients in their proposed drug product. And they need to provide the information that demonstrates that such an inactive ingredient does not affect the safety or efficacy of the proposed drug product. You heard that in Dr. Ghosh's presentation and multiple times throughout the presentations in this section. There isn't a requirement to verify that some of the inactive ingredients that are known to be problematic in a pediatric population. There isn't a requirement to demonstrate that they do not, that they're not, in the proposed generic product. So instead, applicants should, as I mentioned, just make sure that the information provided in the applicant provides enough, information, safety, clinical, non-clinical information to justify the levels and to characterize and to identify and characterize those excipients that are actually in their product.
Thank you. Our next question is also for you, Lisa. Can an excipient be accepted by FDA upon independent review by the agency through searching and finding an FDA-approved product with higher MDE, even if this info has not been provided by the applicant?
So let me make sure I understand the question. The question is that if the applicant didn't identify higher levels of a proposed inactive ingredient, whether or not FDA, with having information provided to them, would be able to make an independent assessment, even if the applicant hadn't submitted that information. Is that correct?
That is how I am interpreting the question.
Okay.
Yes.
Well, I'm going to answer the question based on that interpretation, and the answer is yes. Right? If an excipient is used in an FDA-approved drug product for a particular route of administration, or or in a specific patient population, the excipient can generally be considered safe for use in a similar manner for a similar type of product. Again, providing that the information that's known about the excipient and the information that we have about the proposed product follows the principles of similar context of use. That is the route of administration, patient population, the level of exposure, those things are similar.
Thank you so much. Our next set of questions is for Stuti. The first one is it possible to use the excipients used for the oral route of administration in the rectal route if the excipient is not available in the IID for rectal route of administration?
Thank you for the question, Michelle. So short answer is no, because reference of oral products does not cover the mucosal safety, and any drug product used via rectal route has to justify the safety of inactive ingredient for mucosa. So therefore, you cannot extrapolate the safety of an oral route administered excipient to the rectal route. And yeah, so you have to consider context of use every time you are trying to extrapolate data for an inactive ingredient from one route to another route or one type of dosage form to another. Consider the context of use.
Great, thank you so much. And then next question is for Sue. Can an applicant reference an excipient and its level that has an IID listing for a different dosage form from the proposed ANDA?
Well, I'm going to give my answer from the IID viewpoint, and I think maybe Stuti or Lisa might want to jump in from a medical viewpoint. So from the IID viewpoint, you can reference an excipient for the same route of administration as the drug that's under development in the ANDA. That can be referenced, and you can justify it and use the IID as your support. However, it doesn't necessarily mean that that excipient is appropriate for the particular drug that you're formulating. And that's where I'd like to turn it over to Stuti or Lisa, if you want to jump in about what's appropriate, because the toxicology side is a whole nother story. Stuti, did you want to jump in and say anything about choosing a different dosage form?
I can provide just some general comments for the clinical considerations. So the excipient safety of a product should consider, as Stuti just recently said, context of use, right? So we should consider whether or not the assessment requires, consideration of both local or systemic, potential risks, and how using a different route of administration or a different level of exposure impacts that different population. Again, principles of context of use. So when you're proposing to reference a different route, you should consider those factors. I'll just reiterate, context of use is the foundation of all of these safety assessments. And so from a clinical standpoint, it's important to consider, what the potential risks are given the differences in those exposures and that results from that route of administration.
Sorry, Susan, at that time I could not unmute myself. So I agree with Dr. Faulcon. She actually put it very nicely. So as I said, that context of use drives the safety evaluation of the excipient. So if it is for different dosage of dosage form, then possibly it is not for same context of use. And if it is not, then you might have to rethink and consider the route of administration, patient population, dosage form. Thank you.
Great, thank you so much. We are getting close on time. I think we probably have one last question. Let's see. So a question for Sue. For a particular route of administration, why are some IID records for an excipient where the maximum potency per unit dose is actually higher than the listed NDE?
Yeah, as I mentioned during the presentation, we're currently in the process of including MDE for all of the records that we can get information for. So sometimes you'll see for a particular excipient, we have only maximum potency, and for others we have only MDE. Let me rephrase that. For the same excipient, you might see a record that has only maximum potency and one that has MDE. These records are coming from all different applications. So the application from which the MDE came from might be something that has a much lower dosing than the one that had the maximum potency. There's no connection between the two records. If you are formulating a product and you're trying to justify the use of that excipient for the dosage form in which the excipient is going to be used, you can choose the record that has the highest amount to justify the amount that you're intending to use. And I only caveat that with what Lisa and Stuti had said, which is you do have to consider whether or not the excipient and its level is appropriate within the context of use of your product. And I hope that answered the question as clearly as I could.
Thank you so much. It looks like we have exhausted our time. I want to thank everyone, all the speakers, our panelists for their participation, and our audience. We will have a 10-minute break followed by session 4. Thank you, everyone.